I guess we've heard quite a lot about food security and also food quality from our previous two speakers. And in fact, they're both essential determinants of population health. But there are some other very important ways that coal seam gas puts health at risk. And I think in the sort of debate over this industry, this is often a consequence that is somewhat forgotten. So I'd like to focus today on talking about chemicals, the coal seam contaminants, air pollution, and also mental health. But first, I'd just like to dispel a myth. Coal seam gas and shale are actually both types of unconventional gas. A lot is made of the differences between shale gas in the United States and coal seam gas in Australia by the industry here. They claim that no comparisons can be made, and therefore the increasingly concerning reports coming out of the United States have absolutely no relevance to us. But in fact, there's a lot of coal seam gas in the United States, and there's plentiful shale gas in Australia. In fact, in the Cooper Basin, there's a lot of shale gas in South Australia. BHP are looking to develop that quite soon. So the extraction techniques are exactly the same, and it's only the depth and the permeability of the rock formation that is different. Coal seam gas tends to be shallower and more permeable, and hence not all wells require hydraulic fracturing. That said, in the Camden Gas Project, AGL has said that they fracked 60% of those wells. So it's quite a high percentage. So the unconventional gas industry uses chemical additives for both drilling wells and for hydraulic fracturing or fracking. 20 to 80% of the fracking fluid stays underground. And fracking can create connections between the coal seam and aquifers. And even just depressurising the coal seam can change water levels in surrounding groundwater systems and also the slow flow of water underground. Our single biggest barrier to understanding the direct health impacts of this industry is that there is no mandatory requirement for companies to disclose exactly what chemicals they use. And that's the case in the United States and also here in Australia. Big problem. So what information has been published recently about the toxicity of these chemicals? Well, a UK study reviewed information on 260 chemicals which were supplied to New York State for the industry, and these are the findings here. In Australia, NICNAS is responsible for undertaking comprehensive hazard assessments on chemicals used in industry. In their evidence to the Federal Senate inquiry, they reported that they had a list of about 50 or 60 chemicals, but that wasn't definitive, and they were still gathering. It's just all that they'd gathered so far. And this is our national chemical regulator, so they're supposed to know what's going on, but they clearly didn't. In fact, they'd only examined 4 of those chemicals, and none had been examined specifically for use in fracking. And this is an important point. So while there might be one set of safety concerns if you spill something on your skin, there might be a whole different sort of health impact if you're, say, ingesting that chemical in small quantities in your drinking supply over a long period of time. These are the 4 assessed chemicals. The persulfates, which are the first 2, are also used in hair bleach, and butoxyethanol is actually a carcinogen, and that now contaminates the drinking water. It's an underground water supply for a town called Pavilion in Wyoming in the United States, and that's thanks to intensive gas operations in that area. That's a whole town with contaminated water. Other chemicals that we know are used in Australia are there, and they include ethylene glycol. That's also used to make antifreeze. If you ingest ethylene glycol, it starts to break down in the body, creates crystals which deposit in your kidneys and affect your kidney function. And coal seam gas companies frequently infer safety of these chemicals due to the fact that some are components of household products. However, just because we might have hair bleach and antifreeze in our cupboard doesn't mean that it's safe to drink it. It's amazing the stuff they expect us to buy, isn't it, really? So I'm going to talk about this paper a fair bit, Spanberg and Oswald. It's very recently published, just last month in fact, and it's about the US unconventional gas experience. And it gives us an indication of the direct health consequences that we're going to face here in Australia unless we fully assess and regulate these chemicals. This study is a collection of case reports of ill health in animals and their human owners living in close proximity to gas operations. In one case, the release of fracking fluids into a cow pasture killed 17 cows in 1 hour. Now, that stuff's got to be highly toxic to do that. Exposure to drilling chemicals occurred in another case when blowout fluids ran into a pasture and pond where bred cows were grazing, and their calves were subsequently stillborn and they had a lot of congenital defects. So there were 2 cases where there was a sort of an inadvertent case control study on cattle farms where they had cattle in one paddock that was exposed to gas wastewater, which had been released probably illegally into the stream, and then another group of cattle that were away from the contaminated water. And in both those cases, about half the cattle exposed died, and for the rest, there was a lot of stillbirths, a lot of deformities or stunted growth in the offspring. Whilst the cattle that were away from that contaminated water were completely healthy, unaffected. Okay, so of the 24 cases they examined, 16 documented health problems. And of course, having these sorts of symptoms doesn't prove that the gas operations caused them. And we all get headaches, right? However, they've described 2 cases in a lot of detail, and the evidence for causality, I think, is quite overwhelming. In the first, a child was living in a house less than a mile from a well pad and became unwell with fatigue, severe abdominal pain, sore throat and backache. Eventually, the child was hospitalised about 6 months later, and they had delirium or acute confusional state, and tests revealed arsenic poisoning. The family stopped drinking the water from their well, despite later testing, much later, about a year later, which indicated it was safe to drink. And the child gradually recovered, but they did lose a year of school. Now, if it hadn't been for the fact that there'd been numerous animal deaths, both companion animals and herd animals, then the doctors in the hospital probably wouldn't have ordered the right tests and the diagnosis wouldn't have been made. The family of this particular household and another 1 mile away were then, I think, randomly monitored for these sorts of things, and urine tests revealed high levels of phenol, which is a metabolite of benzene. The levels were consistent with chronic exposure of 0.5 to 4 parts per billion in the air of benzene. So they were experiencing symptoms such as headaches, extreme fatigue, nosebleeds, rashes, loss of smell, loss of hearing, and they were advised to move out by their physicians. One of the families did move out and they got better. The other family stayed and they didn't get better. In fact, they got a bit worse. These last 2 cases illustrate the other source of toxins in unconventional gas operations, and that is the contaminants which coexist with gas in the shale or coal formation. Coal seam water contains volatile organic compounds, including the BTEX chemicals. It also contains heavy metals and radioactive compounds. It's a toxic brew, basically. Oh, and salt, lots of salt. And when those piles of salt emerge from all these operations, I think it might have been Rosemary who mentioned that it's basically contaminated with trace heavy metals and radioactive isotopes from the coal seam water. So it's not just salt you can put on your tomato sandwich or something. Okay. So toluene and ethylbenzene can damage the nervous system, liver and kidneys, and ethylbenzene is a possible human carcinogen. Benzene is a known carcinogen. Long-term exposure to benzene can affect your bone marrow, cause anemia and eventually leukemia. Benzene can present a risk to health even in minute quantities. So the safe level in drinking water is actually the level of detection, which is 1 part per billion. BTEX chemicals have been banned for use in fracking in Queensland and New South Wales, but the fracking process itself may release BTEX from sediments and into surrounding air and water. And volatile Volatile coal seam contaminants like this, and also volatile chemicals that are used in drilling and fracking, cause air pollution in the vicinity of gas operations. And that either occurs from the wastewater that's lying in evaporation ponds or due to a flaring of excess gas. And one practice that was described in this article was that they use the wastewater and they spread it on the icy roads to break up the ice, so it's just kind of lying around in puddles just on the roads. This is how the dogs and cats became deceased from drinking this water anyway. So inhalation is yet another route of exposure. And it was probably to blame for a lot of the benzene poisoning in the case that we've just described. And in the case of arsenic poisoning of the child, near where they lived, the wastewater was held in ponds and it was deliberately misted into the air in order for it to evaporate more quickly. And it's probably turned the arsenic into arsine, which is a highly sort of active gas and very poisonous. In addition to these sort of direct health effects, there's a lot of indirect health consequences via greenhouse emissions from the extraction and combustion of gas. Fugitive emissions of methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas, contribute substantially to its greenhouse footprint. And the jury is most definitely out on whether there is in fact a greenhouse advantage of gas over coal once emissions from the full life cycle of gas are taken into account. So as a transitional fuel, it's got a credibility problem. And the International Energy Agency has warned that there's a danger that over-reliance on gas will delay the vital transition to renewable energy that's needed to prevent dangerous climate change, which is in itself the biggest health threat to ever face humankind. And it's already killing people. So that's the picture of flaring. Finally, I'd just like to mention mental health and the mental health consequences for families and communities who are facing the sort of battle that these wonderful people are facing. Coal seam gas mining threatens existing sustainable industries such as Hunter Valley wine and tourism, Liverpool Plains food production and Queensland beef exports, to name but a few. It also threatens natural bushland reserves such as the Pilliga scrub, and it industrialises the landscape. It can divide communities into those for and against and create economic winners and losers. And as communities lose their livelihoods and their landscape is affected, their mental health suffers. And this has been very well documented in US gas communities, but also in New South Wales by Dr. Steve Robinson in Gloucester and Dr. Wayne Somerville up in the Northern Rivers. And both these doctors presented evidence to the New South Wales inquiry. So we obviously need more regulation. The oil and gas industry body APIA assures us, and I quote from their website, "Some of the chemicals used in fracking may have some toxic characteristics. However, when diluted, such as in fracking gels, they present minimal to no harm, to no human or ecological risks." Now, I don't know how they can conclude that when there have been no comprehensive studies of animals or human populations exposed to fracking activities. This is a dangerous lack of knowledge for an industry that has already been granted tens of billions of dollars worth of projects in Australia. So Doctors for the Environment recommends a moratorium, and this is what we've asked for, until a comprehensive health impact assessment be taken nationally and of the entire unconventional gas industry, and that includes any shale gas developments that might occur in the future, and as a matter of urgency. Until there's a strong legislative framework which includes the mandatory disclosure of what chemicals and products are used, how much and what stays underground, as well as routine monitoring of air, water and soil for contamination, we're basically working in the dark as to what the likely health impacts are going to be short and long term. I'll leave you with a quote from Bamberger that puts it in a nutshell. "Without rigorous scientific studies, the gas drilling boom sweeping the world will remain an uncontrolled health experiment on an enormous scale." And also, this is a quote from a woman who's done an enormous amount of work in this area. "At what point does preliminary evidence of harm become definitive evidence of harm? When someone says, 'We were not aware of the dangers of these chemicals back then,' Whom do they mean by we? A cute cut. This was my favourite. I looked at a few, but I like this one the best. Because I thought, my God, if I'm a farmer and I've got CSG coming up one road and a wind turbine coming up the other, I know which one I'm going to choose. That's all, thank you.